This is a way to review for the final or midterm or any test that you want to. It's kind of done in a game show format. And it's also two parts. The first part usually takes a class to prepare, and then the following class you actually implement it. The first class period, you break the class into groups. Generally groups of 4 or 5 is best, and each group has to come up with a number of questions. When I do this, they have to come up with 16 multiple choice questions. It's important to also check all the questions to make sure they're accurate and to make sure that they can be answered, because sometimes students might paraphrase and the question might not sound right, or sometimes they come up with a question but the wrong answer. So it's important to check the questions. In my class, they have 16 multiple choice questions, and they're not allowed to have like any tricky D's, like all the above are correct, A and B are correct. The tricky D's won't work in the game show format because I have to read the question to the student. And so if it's not a very simple question, the student gets confused because I'm reading the question back to them. It's not a visual thing, it's an audio thing. And so that usually takes about a class to do for them to come up with questions. So that pretty much wraps up the first day, the first class. The next class is when we actually ask the questions. I write the questions up on the board in numerals, like I'll have column 1, 1 through 8, column 2, 1 through 8, column 3, 1 through 8. And so that way when it's a student's turn to ask the question, they say something like column 2, question 4. Each column represents the group's numbers. So if I'm in group 1, I can't ask questions from column 1. They're still in their groups, and so they're sitting like in a group of 4, but I have one chair separate from the group. I call that the hot seat. Each student has a turn in the hot seat. That student picks the question, and I ask them the question. If they get the question right, they get a series of points. I allow them to, what I call go group. If they can't answer the question themselves, they're allowed to turn to the rest of the group and they can discuss and debate the question. If they can answer the question that way, they get half credit. So if each question's worth like 4 points, if they go group, they'd only get 2 points for that question. Also, for harder questions, like for instance, I have lecture questions and reading questions where students have to read their textbooks to get the information. Those tend to be harder questions, so I give extra points if you ask for a reading question and get it right. So for the harder questions, you might want to bump up the point scale a little bit to get them to ask it, or they'll only ask the easy questions. Generally, the group with the most points at the end gets some extra credit. I personally, I keep the extra credit light because if you give a lot of extra credit, to be honest with you, the groups get kind of competitive and we don't want conflict erupting. So if we keep the extra credit light, they have a more casual approach to it. It just flows smoother. You don't have to worry about conflict. And I have gotten many compliments, students saying that this was a great way to review, because it's like two parts review. One, I'm studying the material to come up with the questions. In the next class, I'm being quizzed on what I just studied. So it's been pretty effective for me through the years. If you want to, you can throw in a extra round or a few extra rounds to jazz things up. Like for instance, I have what I call the lightning round. The group elects one member to represent the entire group for the lightning round. And so they decide who's going to do the lightning round. Then I have that one student stay in the class and all the other representatives leave. I ask that student 4 questions. They have 1 minute to answer the 4 questions. The questions are listing questions, so they have to like name 3 of Freud's stages. They have to name 2 types of conditioning, and they get a point for every item in the list they get. And so they have 1 minute to answer all 4 questions, and it turns out to be quite pressurized and great bit of fun, actually. And so then that student would go back to his seat. The next representative would come out from the hall and have a seat, and I'd ask them the same exact 4 questions. That tends to be pretty popular. Sometimes I'll even have them complete like a short essay question for, even more points. For instance, what do you think is Freud's most accurate theory or accurate stage and why? Things like that. So it's very adaptable. I often get requests to do this for exam 1 and exam 2 because it's such a great way for them to study. But to be honest with you, because of constraints in class time, I just save it for the final, because the final is a more important test, at least point-wise, for the class. So, but yeah, the students are they like it quite a bit, not only because it's fun, but it's engaging.